Do you want to maximize your podcasting profits? Generate those revenues that you wish you had, but you are spinning out of control and you just don't know where to go. You're searching for the solution that will help you achieve that financial success and use your podcast to grow that business that you desire? Well, look no further. Our guest today, Sarah of the Frugalpreneur, is revealing the key strategies and tactics to boost your podcast profits and monetize your content without getting stuck on that hustle hamster wheel. So, if you're ready to unlock the door to increased financial success on a bootstrap while using your podcast to get those massive results that you know are possible, this episode is for you. Let's go. Welcome to the Cure for Pod Fade. I am so excited you found your way here because that means you know how powerful podcasting can be. You are ready to build a legacy with your unique story, your message, and your offer, but you're getting a little overwhelmed. You're feeling frustrated, you're feeling stuck. You just don't know how to grow your show, find a new audience, and make some money. Podcasting can be the ticket to the life of your dreams, and it doesn't have to be as hard as you think. We're talking about all the ingredients it takes to be a successful, profitable podcaster without that icky overwhelm, because you are too magical to join the 85% plus club that pod fades away. I'm your host, Jen Dragonette, so let's make podcasting easy peasy lemon squeezy. Now, before we dig into this juicy episode, I've got to talk to you about our sponsor, Capsho, the ultimate AI content marketer for you, the podcaster. Here's the thing. You know, I'm a podcast producer. I'm producing mass amounts of content every week. If you're feeling overwhelmed with your one show, Capsho might be your new BFF. Capsho allows you to upload your podcast and it creates content from that, not from everywhere all over the internet like those other AI softwares out there. And by using Capsho, my blog has increased by 600% in clicks and in traffic. My YouTube channel is growing, and I don't feel stressed out about having to show up on every single platform out there and create content because Capsho is doing the heavy lifting for me. So, as a podcaster, you know that talking is the easy part, but content writing might not be your thing. You're thinking, maybe I should hire a VA. Maybe you tried to hire a VA and that just wasn't the right solution. Well, Capsho is your new BFF in content creation for all your copy needs and creating those little short nuggets of gold that you're going to sprinkle all over the internet to bring people into your amazing show. Because here at the Cure for Pod Fade, we're making things easy peasy lemon squeezy. So, of course, we had to be sponsored by Capsho. So, without further ado, let's get into this episode. We have an amazing guest today who has been podcasting for 4 years. That's forever in podcast land. Has over 200 episodes and is also someone who specializes in our favorite subject here on the Cure for Pod Fade, profits. So welcome to the podcast, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad I'm finally here.
Little bit behind that statement is we've been trying for a little over a year to make this work, but it's happening. And I think that because you've just recently hit this 4-year milestone, this is the perfect time to talk about this because most people are out by 7 to 10 episodes. Some people make it a year. You're on year 4. So I want to know 4 years ago, why did you decide podcasting?
Yeah, so I started my podcast called Frugalpreneur. The tagline is building a business on a bootstrap budget. I started it as a extra way to market a book that I was releasing, also called Frugalpreneur. And so it was kind of like an extra marketing avenue. And the plan was to only be like 10 episodes or so. But I was getting more leverage and traction with the podcast than the book. And I love the networking and connections and the conversations and even the friendships and just the community all around. And so I just kept doing it. And now, yeah, a little over 4 years in and a little over 200 episodes later, I'm still doing it.
So I think this is really interesting because most people who have been in or doing podcasting and had a single podcast for many years, we've changed the name. You have not. So I want to know, like, okay, so after 4 years, one of the biggest things I hear is, I'm going to run out of things to talk about on my show. Have you changed that tagline? Have you changed anything about that specific when you set it up day one? Or have you been able to come up with subjects for the last 4 years to keep the Frugalpreneur going?
Yeah, I haven't changed anything. The cover art, the name, the tagline. And the reason I did a tagline, because I know most people don't, I did it because the name itself, I think most people will know what it's about just by reading it. But at the same time, there's some people that might not make the connection that means frugal entrepreneur. So I put that tagline in there just to kind of help with that. But yeah, I've never changed it. I've considered it a couple of times. I've considered changing it to just the tagline, the podcast being called "Building a Business on a Bootstrap," or something like that. But everyone I've talked to about that, they said, no, don't do, because they say don't name it some cutesy made up fake word for your podcast. Well, and I did, but I guess I'm one of the exceptions that it works. And everyone I've talked to says they love the name, don't change it. So yeah.
Yeah, and you said that it was working. You said in the beginning, like you were going to do 10 episodes. You started the networking, it started being an amazing asset. So tell me a little bit about how your podcast has been an asset for your business. Because again, for those people that are thinking of giving up on your show, as you grow, as you go, it does get better.
Yeah. So the thing is, I've had so many different businesses through the years, and I think that's part of being an entrepreneur is shiny object syndrome, and we just keep getting ideas. So when I launched the show, I was doing a bunch of different things, and that's kind of why I wrote the book and started the podcast was it was kind of covering the different ways to make money online or different business models and like how to run them on basically under $100 a month was my thing. And but as I've grown to love podcasting and the community and all that stuff, I decided to, and I was producing my own show. So then I decided to start doing that for other people. Well, now I'm switching actually into more like podcast education, growth, marketing, monetization versus like production. So it's kind of evolved, I guess. But so the thing is, all that to say, the podcast itself, Frugalpreneur, while I do talk about podcasting on the show and I do talk about what I do in the podcasting industry and all that stuff, there isn't like a direct correlation really, unless a listener does have a podcast or they want to start a podcast or whatever. So I'm actually in the process of, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Actually, okay, kind of going back to your first question, I thought about keeping the podcast but rebranding it entirely to a podcast about podcasting, basically. But I was like, but I really like this frugalpreneur thing. And so anyway, so then I was like, well, maybe I should start a second podcast. And I just kept blowing it off. But I'm finally in the process of launching another podcast specifically about podcasting. It's going to be called The Podcast Audit, where like I have people on and I walk through like kind of look over like they'll submit something to me ahead of time to where I review it ahead of time and whatever, and then walk through an audit basically, almost like a coaching call, I suppose. So that's what it's going to be. And I'm hoping that that podcast then will be direct. I'll have clients coming directly from that. So with Frugalpreneur, the best way that I've monetized it is, I guess you could almost consider it more of a case study, I suppose, like using it as a case study for the things I do with podcasting, but then also the occasional affiliate or sponsorship. But yeah, so it's not a direct connection. And so I guess when I do launch that other podcast, probably my call to action and Frugalpreneur will change to, if you've ever thought about starting a podcast or you have a podcast, check out my other podcast, because it's going to be easier to get a podcast listener to listen to another podcast than to like go download my lead magnet, which I can do with the podcast. Yeah, whatever. That's all. That was a long roundabout way of describing that.
But I love your point there is that once somebody's on the app, it's easier to get them to do something else on the same app. I think that so much of the time that podcasters spend is doing the wrong things to actually grow the show. There's been a couple things you've mentioned. Is one is like getting them to go to your other show and then from there going into something. Two, you also mentioned the power of networking.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, that's one of the things that's grown my show, my business, like my bank account, everything has been, although my other show, because I did have a second show, which sadly is ending
Oh.
on October 4th after 3 years, 3.5 years.
Oh,
But
what was your
I'm,
first show?
it's called Feed Your Business with Love.
Oh, okay.
And I love it. And I might not be ending it forever, but I'm putting a pin in it for this exact reason is I want to grow and do that networking piece. I want to find that piece that you're creating that second podcast. I want to create that funnel with my show also. So I think it's really important for the listeners to hear those things is it's like you're intentionally creating a second show, but not giving up your first show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of people, when they kind of switch modes, they just take their existing show and change the name of it, the cover art, and all of that. Which, I mean, if you're totally changing gears and you're tired and over your first show, then I think that makes sense. Versus starting a new one and then having to start over with a whole new listener base and like downloads and reviews. So I get that. But because I still want to I don't want to give up the Frugalpreneur show. But I see that it's a little difficult to get. It's just not a direct way to monetize because there's people listening to that show that they might be coaching or they might be affiliate marketers or bloggers or YouTubers or self-published authors or whatever kind of online business, Etsy store. I don't know. So yeah.
And I love that. And I love your message about like, you can do business on a bootstrap. You
Mm-hmm.
really can. I think there's so many coaches out there, even other people. Like I'm in the same industry as you. This is why I love talking to other industry experts because there's enough work to go around. And it's fun to talk to other experts that are making it easy because so many experts out there that are, especially in our podcast field, are like, you need to have this program and this software and this. And I'm like, hold up. Now you're asking me to spend $300 a month on just software to support my courses and my podcasts and for editing and all these things. I'm not even making $1 yet. Like I love that you're combining these two because the Frugalpreneur meets podcasting. I'm like, this is gold.
Still on that topic, there was a brief period where I thought about changing the tagline to building a business on a bootstrap budget through the power of podcasting. But I'm like, that is a
Ooh,
lot.
that's a lot.
So I'm like, probably not.
Oh, I'm like, but it could be I mean, I'm still like, I'm on that because it's true. And it's something that I think a lot of podcasters get into is like they either don't spend any money at all and then they spend all their time editing and not marketing, or they spend so much money on random things that don't work, or worse, buying downloads from those podcast promoters that come into our inbox.
Mm.
Oh, anyways,
Yeah.
I'm not going down that rabbit hole, but so for somebody who's wanting to, let's say they're already creating, like, let's say you're Frugalpreneur, let's kind of deconstruct that with your profit method. How could we, if they didn't want to start a second show, like if you didn't want to start a second show, how would you look at your show to be able to monetize that one? You mentioned something like sponsors and things like that, but what are some other ways that you could monetize that first show for those people that are like, I don't see the correlation with money in my current topic?
And when I say sponsors, I should clarify or like the typical sponsorship model, unless you have about 10,000 downloads, and I don't know if it's episode or month, whatever, it's not the best route to go. So the way I've done it is reached out to companies directly, like software companies, of some software I use and would recommend, and I've gotten a lot of sponsorships that way, and that usually will pay a flat amount, whether it's $50 an episode. That's kind of what I started at, and whatever. And so you'll get a higher, if you're not getting those 10,000 downloads, then that'll end up being a higher, what was it, CPM or whatever. Uh, and a lot of companies are, if you reach out to them directly, I mean, yeah, it doesn't hurt. As far as sponsorships, that's what I've done. And then, and sometimes they'll be like, I'll do 10 episodes. So then now there's $500 if they're 50 each. But, and then there's affiliates, which I've also used where, like, say I have an author on. Well, obviously in the show notes, I'm going to link to their book, and Amazon, granted, that's only going to be pennies or whatever. But the nice thing about Amazon is that you get the commission on the total cart value. So if someone decides to buy a flat screen TV the same day that they buy that book that you recommended, well, then you're going to have a bigger payout. But, or say like you have someone on your show who is talking about a coaching program or a software or whatever it is, a course. If they have an affiliate or even a referral program, you could monetize that way as well. So those are some like direct ways to do it. But I feel like there's probably always a way to monetize a podcast, even if it's the most random. I mean, I've heard of like fishing podcasts with maybe 100 listeners bringing in 6 figures from, and it wasn't even the CPM model. It was them approaching companies directly and getting sponsorships and all this stuff. So there are ways to do it. And sometimes the more niche you are, the more you can actually make in a way. So yeah, or like if you have a podcast about, let's say you're doing a podcast about knitting. I don't know. Maybe you could create a course or something that teaches someone how to knit. There's just any kind of hobby that even that you like. Because a lot of people are like, well, it's just a hobby podcast. It doesn't really have a business tied to it or whatever. There's still, you could create a course or get sponsors maybe, or there's always a way, I think, to monetize.
I love that. And one of the things that I hear is that niche specific. And I love that you brought up like knitting and stuff like this. I always call it like my rock climbers. If you were a rock climbing podcast in like the middle California, you could reach out to the company that sells rock climbing gear that's there, and they're going to want to pay, even if you only have 100 listeners. So that's one of the things that I just want to reiterate is that it's not about the downloads, it's about the quality of the person that's listening. Because, and that's one of the scary things, right? Is the niching down, the niching down, the niching down. I'm like, I have problem with it. This is called the cure for pod fade. That's pretty not niche. I mean, pod fade is kind of niche, but there's so many things that go under pod fade between mindset and monetization. I'm like, I could get really hyper focused, like pod fade for the podcasters that have been podcasting for 2+ years that are in this specific niche. And those numbers might mean something more if you create something that's directly related to your podcast. So I want to make sure that the listeners heard that, because that's a mic drop. That's a piece of gold. I hope you all wrote that down.
And I've also thought about creating a podcast. This is like way on the back burner of like the local town I'm in, which is in a suburb of Dallas. And but it creating like this hyper local show that's just about the town and like the businesses in the town, the restaurants and whatever, and like approaching those businesses and being like, okay, I'm launching this podcast about this town. Anyone who listens to this podcast is going to be here locally. Would you be interested in sponsoring or whatever? I don't know. I might do that at some point, just kind of, if nothing else, as like a case study, I suppose, or kind of a trial or test. I don't know.
Oh, I'm like, I never thought of like, I knew like location specific, but I love that. And then you could have each like business owner on. So we're giving you guys a ton of ideas here. Like,
Yeah, the plan was to have like each, and it was going to be like a video podcast where I go to the restaurant, for example, and interview the owner. Yeah, all this stuff I have in my head.
But I think that's fun. And I think that because you did kind of what I did. You started in podcasting, you became a producer, now you're helping coach. The power of podcasting is huge. Like with the networking, with the able to connect to your audience, actually convert. But one of the things that we get stuck in is that we don't market our shows. So, what is one thing that you're doing with your clients and your own shows to help you get out there more? Because podcast SEO is terrible.
Well, there's a few things. One, I definitely recommend having a website for your show. If nothing else, say you already have a website, at least have a tab up there that says podcast, and then that has your, a podcast player on it. Or you could use something like Podpage, which, disclaimer, I work for them part time. But something like that where it's like podcast specific. It's a whole standalone website, and then you can play around with SEO and different integrations and stuff. But also, like, just getting in, like, say, podcast newsletters, or like different podcast apps or players, like ones that have kind of a social component, like Good Pods or Podvine, and there's probably others. Those are the main two I use. Where you can actually, like, directly communicate with, because on Apple, for example, you might get a good rating and review, but, like, how do you communicate with that person? Whereas Good Pods, Podvine, and other places, I guess Podchaser probably, you can actually see, like, who's commenting and interact. So I think that's a good thing. Also, of course, starting a newsletter as well. But and then you can also, depending on your budget, and of course I'm the frugalpreneur, so I usually don't spend more than $100 a month at least, at most, to do an ad or something. But there are different platforms where you can run an ad for like $100. Buzzsprout is one. Buzzsprout ads. Is it Castro or Castos? One of those. I get those two confused. I think it's Casto. I don't. No, I think it's Castro actually. That you can run an ad for like 7 days for $99, and then there's Malpod or Mopod where you can do like $100 thing, and then Headliner offers something. It used to be called Disco, but now I think it's Promo or something like that, where it ends up being like 25 cents a download, basically. So, but I think those types of things, like, it might give you an initial boost of downloads. The issue is, do those people I mean, the times I've done it, I've definitely noticed a boost, of course, and that my episodes after that are still higher than they were before. So obviously not all of the people are probably going to stick around, but at least it gets it out there for people who didn't know about it. So yeah, you could just kind of play around with some of those different ads if you want to throw money behind it. And then, like, Pod News is a podcast newsletter where the only ads I've run on that are like the $29 ones. That's the cheapest you can do. But you have to book like at least 2 months out and you have to, like, do it quick because those go fast. Because as it gets closer, when that, because it's a daily newsletter. So when it gets closer to the day, the rate goes up. I think, I don't know, maybe up to 500 or something. So, but yeah, there's other newsletters as well. There's Podfest Messenger, which I think they have some free options, at least last I knew. So yeah, just looking for ways to kind of get out there, either free or maybe an ad for under $100.
I love that you brought up things that weren't social media too, because I think
Oh, I
that
didn't even bring that up at all,
I
did I?
know it's great because see, here's my thing is that I think that although social media is great, I find it warms your audience. Like your audience goes from your podcast, your warm audience to there where you can actually, like you mentioned, it's hard to connect with people. I don't find personally that social media to podcast is that easy. Especially once your audience is already warm, they know it's there. They're like, whatever. they either have come over or they haven't come over at this point. So I love that you've given other ideas because there's so much time that is spent creating assets for social media that don't work.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think, yeah, it's good to have social media and throw it out there, but don't spend a whole lot of time and attention to that versus like these podcast first kind of platforms. And I like how you said that you could, that it's more like people come from your podcast to your social media versus vice versa. So, yeah.
So I want to know, like, in 4 years, there's had to be a time when you're like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. If I have to talk to one more person, if I put out one more episode, if I have to publish or produce, I'm going to lose my mind. Like, there had to be a moment in time that that happened. How did you push through to keep going?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple things. One would be batching, which I'm sure you've talked about. Oh, you. Oh,
We
okay.
have not talked batching here.
Well, like and basically what that is any component within the process you could batch. Like you could batch record. Like say you release one episode a month. I mean, a week. So that's 4 or 5 episodes a month. You could like sit down and record all of those in one day. It'd be a long day, but you could do it and then have a month ready to go for recording. Or you could batch edit or batch produce or cover, whatever it is. So that's one way that I've found is like, because once you're kind of in the rhythm, it's just easier to kind of keep going instead of, yeah. The other thing is, so I'm on these various things like Podmatch and whatever, where it matches like hosts and guests. And so it was getting to the point where so many people were wanting to come on the show that what I've done late, I still do one-on-one interviews that are, 30, 45 minutes, whatever. And I do the occasional solo episode as well. But what I've also been doing a lot lately is I set this thing up called asynchronous recording, which just means, well, first of all, the platform I use for it is called Rumble Studio. It was an AppSumo deal. And so I just paid once. And basically, it's like I have my questions, and then they can go in and record their answer to the questions whenever. And so basically, I ask like 5 questions, and it's like all about kind of frugal entrepreneurship. Like if there's a software or a tip or trick, tactic, technique, whatever that they use to run their business on a budget. And then like what's been their greatest accomplishment, their worst, whatever. I don't remember the exact questions, but and then I say within 2 minutes, please, try to answer those. And so then I then just download the file that has the answer to the audio answer to all the questions. And then I turn that into an episode. And so, yeah, I still have to edit it, but I didn't have to set up a recording time and get on a 30 to 60 minute Zoom or whatever. And then the editing time is actually quite a bit quicker too, because it's usually like a 10-minute episode, which while on that topic, okay, so I recently, just in the past month or two, hit the top 100 for entrepreneurship podcasts in Apple. And
Celebrate.
yeah. And I was like, what? Well, actually, the reason I discovered that was because I noticed my download numbers were going up all of a sudden. And I'm like, what's going on? And then I was telling some podcast friends about it. And then they were the one who discovered, they actually looked and they're like, you're in the top. Well, initially it was 200 and then it got to top 100. Or like, you're also in essentials and all this stuff. And I'm like, well, what's up with that? So then I went into Apple Podcast Connect or whatever it's called and noticed that ever since I had been releasing shorter episodes, that I've been getting more downloads, but also the average consumption time of the episode has gone up dramatically. which I think factors into their algorithm. And so I'm just like learning all these things just by doing shorter episodes.
Yeah. I noticed that also. I have one client that she hit some charts. She was, I think, 173 in all categories.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, what is going on? Because we've never been on any of the charts. And that was exactly it. We went from 50-minute episodes to like 30, 35-minute episodes.
Mm.
And when there was a consistent amount of those 30-minute episodes, granted, she also went mega viral on one of the social media platforms, which helped at the same time. But I think the combination of the two and having that consumption rate go up, because although it's long form content, people don't want to listen, like, or don't have time to listen. I listen at 2 times the speed. So, 30-minute podcasts are 15. But again, as a producer, I'm trained to listen to audio, so I can absorb at that.
Yeah, I've never been one to I don't do the 2 time. I listen in real time and I subscribe to about 50 podcasts. Yours is one of them, actually. I subscribe to
Thank you.
50 podcasts. Most of them are about podcasting in some way, shape, or form, or business, I suppose. But what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, I listen in real time. I've never been, I don't know. But yeah, I think it's good to have maybe a variety of short and long, or interview and solo, or I mean, these aren't solo episodes. There's basically I basically come on for the intro and then the outro, basically, but it's them throughout the middle. But yeah, I wasn't sure how it would go, but it seems like people like it.
Like, it's hitting the charts. It's
Yeah.
going well. Now we're just going to monetize it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I love that. I don't know, like there's so much there that you've just dropped so many nuggets. And like, that's one of the things I think we need to learn to get to the point. And I know I need to work on that because I am master of let's talk on and on and on. So I want to know, because you're in the industry, what do you think the biggest reason people pod fade out?
I think they go into it not either knowing or not fully understanding all the post production or and not just so there's the editing and production, all that stuff, but then like the show notes and the graphics and the social media posts and the videograms and just all the different things you can do. And I think they just think, and some people probably do just go and record, don't even edit or anything, and just throw it up. I mean, whatever. But I think most people try to do all the back end or post production stuff, and they either don't think about that or know it or don't realize how long it takes. I would think that that's probably the biggest reason people pod fade. I don't think it's so much the actual recording in and of itself, because a lot of people actually will record tons of episodes and they just never get around to editing them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely, I see that. And I see, again, I think there's a lot of disservice on the internet as we're looking for what to do, how to market our shows, is that people focus on all the things instead of the things that, like, get good at one thing at a time. I think we met in Adam's space a long time ago, if I'm not mistaken. I think we were in
Oh, Adam Adams.
Adam, I forget what his
Oh, Adam
last name was.
Shively.
Yes. I
Okay.
think we met in there, and that was one thing that I took away from his community was like, get really good at like one thing. So if you're getting overwhelmed by that post production, like let's clean up the episode a little bit and let's focus on one platform. Like let's focus on one other way. And like you mentioned before, I think a blog is a great place to start. And you mentioned, I think it was pod page.
Yeah, for a website.
Yeah. So we'll make sure to get your link for that in the show notes, because any way that we can make this easy. This doesn't mean you have to set up a whole website, all of that. I'm assuming that it's something that's specific for podcasters. So even
Right.
starting there, where you can get some sort of SEO traction, because you're not getting that from your show.
Yeah, exactly.
So what would be your ingredient you'd want to add to the cure for pod fade?
I mean, I guess probably batching. That I think that's probably for me anyway, that's been the best way to avoid, because then if you can batch stuff and get at least 1 month out or more, then, and you only have to deal with it on, let's say, 1 day a month or 1 day I don't know. It kind of depends on how often you release episodes, I suppose. But yeah, get into that kind of rhythm, then I think that's what's helped me.
Yeah. That's something I need to get into. That's something I need to teach my clients because I always feel like it's like the 19th hour. Like, oh no, I have an episode that goes out in 4 hours. Now what do I do? I guess I'm not sleeping tonight. So I think batching is a great ingredient.
Mhm.
So where can people find you?
My podcast is at frugal.show. Oh, and speaking of Podpage, that's a Podpage website, so that kind of gives you a feel for what it would look like. But so that's frugal.show. And then I've self-published a few books that I give away the PDF version of, and I believe that I better check. I believe that's frugal.show/free. And that'll take you to like 4 PDFs basically.
To get access to all your cool books.
Yeah. So I would say those are the main ways. And then if you want to do social, it's at the Sarah St. John everywhere.
And we'll also get all that stuff in the show notes because we like things easy peasy lemon squeezy over here on the Cure for Pure. I can't even say it. Tongue tied over here on the Cure for Pod Fades. You don't have to be perfect to podcast.
Right. Exactly. Done is better than perfect.
Yes. Oh, man. Boom. Mic drop. Done is better than perfect. We're going to leave it right there.